A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our very favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, exploring history, time, space, and beyond. And of course, as always, glad to bring you the very best in the world of archaeology and studies of our ancient past. Joining me for another round from right here in the Cross Time Pub, that esoteric locale where we all gather together and convene from time to time, are my friends, my cohorts, my colleagues, Jason Pentrail and James Waldo. Jason, looks like you got a tan. Have you been on the road lately, sir?
Well, yeah, we actually have, and we've just wrapped up the very first spring 2022 tour of the mound building cultures of the Southeast, and even made our way out James's way and into Oklahoma. So we had a lot of great experiences on this trip. It was the first time we've ever done this with another media group. So it was the Seven Ages team with Chasing History. And of course, Micah being down there in Brazil, still working hard, lining up some very interesting things for us, as well as his own personal projects. We missed you, and we did have quite a few people asking about you and kind of lamenting the fact that you weren't able to join us, but we will definitely get you on the next one for sure.
Indeed. Well, I missed being out there and being able to join you guys. Indeed, it's been beautiful down here in Brazil. Currently, I am scheduled to return stateside just within a few days, but alas, I didn't make it in time to be able to join you guys this time. I'm sure you all had a great time and certainly did a great job propagating that formula. And James, I know you were working double duty because between you and I and the number of stories that we tell when we're together on the road, you probably had to do a lot more talking than usual, huh?
Yeah, I probably did a lot of talking, and it was actually a lot of fun because I got to play tour guide here for Jason and Chase. They came here and stayed at the house. We had some exciting weather in the evening, and then we went and saw some cool stuff here in the area, and we went over to Oklahoma and saw some things. And I actually, it was fairly illuminating in ways that I did not appreciate it would be, because after we shot some of those videos for Facebook, I got a pretty good look at the dad bod I have developed over the last couple of years, which is, I actually needed to see that. It kind of motivated me to kind of maybe get out and get a little exercise this spring and this summer.
Indeed, nothing like being on camera to remind you what you really look like. In fact, I was in a call right before I joined you guys here in the Cross Time Pub with my friend and colleague Chrissy Newton. She and I are lining up some adventures out west, and indeed, I'm hoping this too is going to involve some archaeology and some examination of some ancient pictographs and petroglyphs. You guys know that's one of my very favorite things. And speaking of road trips and traveling and petroglyphs, Jason, that reminds me of the trip you and I took, of course, to Geological, Iraq some time ago. One of my very favorite places, and again, some of the best examples of petroglyphs from ancient cultures anywhere, in my opinion, in the Southeast.
Yeah, that's always a great place to go, and it's like a little gem hidden there in that little valley. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, and it's something that we just don't get to see here on the East Coast, nothing to the degree that you see out west. So yeah, I have yet to get out to see the Western archaeology. It's something that's been on my list for years, and so I know you've had opportunities to head out that way. Hopefully, when you come back with some good information, then we'll know exactly where to go and what to see when we finally get that Western trip for Seven Ages.
Well, indeed. And of course, wherever the three of us are, either together or spread apart in different parts of the world, in fact, we always do a bit of roving reporting and try and get a feel for the archaeology of the area where we are and where we'll be, or maybe where we've been in the collective sense of things. That's really what this is all about, is knowing where we've been, where we've come from, and learning about the ancient past.
And as the learning about the ancient past continues, there has been in the last year in the world of archaeology much discussion challenging our interpretation of the peopling of America. Now, this has been a hot topic. We've been following it very closely here at 7 Ages Audio Journal and keeping up with all of the latest. This new paper coming out, this is coming basically summarized for us from ScienceDaily.com, called Study Challenges Theories of Earlier Human Arrival in the Americas. This came out on April 20th, and it's coming from the University of Wyoming. So a new analysis of archaeological sites in the Americas challenges relatively new theories that the earliest human inhabitants of North America arrived before the migration of people from Asia across the Bering Strait. So this was conducted by University of Wyoming professor Todd Survell, along with colleagues from the University of Wyoming, with 5 other institutions. The analysis suggests that misinterpretation of archaeological evidence at certain sites in North and South America might be responsible for theories that that humans arrived long before 13,000 to 14,200 years ago. So as we're leading into the details, some of those stories that we've seen here in the last few years, there's been some out of Mexico, some out of South America. The one that really has gotten the attention here recently has been the white sands footprints that we reported on here on the show and has been all over the media. We've actually reached out to quite a few archaeologists who are kind of in the position of let's just wait and see what else we can find evidence-wise before they jump on. But as we continue with this story, the researchers' findings appear in the PLOS, or the Public Library of Science 1 journal. The paper is the latest development in the debate over the peopling of Americas, in which some are now questioning the long-held consensus that the first Americans were hunter-gatherers who entered North America from Asia via the Beringia land bridge that we've discussed many times here on the show, and then dispersed southward between 2 large glaciers that then covered much of the continent. The conclusions of Survell and colleagues are based on the analysis of buried archaeological deposits using a new statistic called Apparent Stratigraphic Integrity Index that they developed. While the stratigraphic integrity of early archaeological sites in Alaska is high, producing strong evidence in support of unambiguous human occupation, the sites in more southern locations pointing to possible earlier human occupations show signs of artifact mixing among multiple time periods. Quote, if humans managed to breach the continental ice sheet significantly before 13,000 years ago, there should be clear evidence for it in the form of at least some stratigraphically discrete archaeological components with a relatively high artifact count. So far, no such evidence exists, end quote. That was coming from Todd Survell and colleagues. They also wrote, quote, our findings support the hypothesis that the first human arrival to the New World occurred by at least 14,200 years ago in Beringia and by approximately 13,000 years ago in the temperate latitudes of North America. Strong evidence for human presence before those dates has yet to be identified in the archaeological record, end quote. Specifically, this new analysis compared the stratigraphic integrity of 3 sites argued to contain evidence of earlier human occupation. 2 of those are in Texas, 1 in Idaho. With the integrity of sites in Alaska, Wyoming, and Pennsylvania, the 3 sites claimed to be older than 13,000 years ago all showed patterns of significant mixing while others did not. The researchers were unable to obtain detailed information about some other sites in North and South America purported to contain evidence of human occupation before 13,000 years ago. Quote, sites claimed to be older than 13,000 years ago are few, and data supporting their status as sites have been poorly disseminated. Survell and his colleagues wrote, given the status of available data regarding these sites, we must question whether there are any sites in the Americas south of the ice sheet that exhibit an unambiguous and stratigraphically discrete cultural occupation with sufficient numbers of artifacts of clear human manufacture. Now, the paper doesn't completely rule out the possibility that humans colonized the Americas at an earlier date. But, quote, they say, if they did, they should have produced stratigraphically discrete occupation surfaces, some of which would be expected to have large numbers of artifacts. Joining Survell in the research were University of Wyoming colleagues Sarah Allen, Robert Kelly, Marcel Kornfield, and Mary Lou Larson. Wyoming state archaeologist Spencer Pelton, Barbara Crass, and Charles Holmes of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Joseph Gingrich of Ohio University, and the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, Kelly Graff of Texas A&M University, and Catherine Krasinski and Brian Weigel of Adelphi University. So quite a distinguished panel there, coming together with the well-known and often controversial Todd Survell from the University of Wyoming to produce this new paper. What are your thoughts?
Well, if I may chime in on this, and of course I'm by no means qualified to do so. I certainly don't have the kind of background and expertise that this panel does. But of course I'm interested in and have long followed the debate between the Clovis occupancy advocates and those who have argued that there are evidences of occupation in North America that predate that, i.e. earlier than Clovis. This is sort of an extension of that debate, and I think it's a meaningful one because it very well may be that there are some very important points here with regard to the way that the data has been interpreted in the past, and maybe there is a good reason to say, how sure are we that all of this data can and should be interpreted the way that it has been? Where are the clearly distinguishable archaeological features in the artifact record and their stratigraphic presence, we'll say, that clearly defines a cultural horizon and thereby a data point by which we can gauge the data that we are looking at? So, I mean, I think it's a very relevant argument that they raise. Now, another opinion of that, which I'm sure some people would outright dismiss what I'm about to say, but again, this is a layman's perspective, take it for what it is. The other side of this is that if we look at really ancient deposits, which over time may have been affected more, those layers may have been disturbed, and there may be geological factors or other factors that contribute to the appearance of artifacts and other archaeological materials that are found in those areas, those lower strata presumably. If there are factors that cause the issues that the researchers here are describing, and they are presenting a way of interpreting that is conforming to a certain ideology or idea, in other words, in this case, maybe the Clovis first model, or the long lingering kind of interpretation that human occupation in North America simply couldn't go back any further than, given date, maybe 13, 14,000 years. Are they seeing from the data what they want to, based on genuine anomalous, or at very least unanswered data that appears relative to this period, if that makes sense? So again, there are a couple of ways to interpret this. I'm open to either one based on what science says, but again, that's why I think I would at least define this as being an extension of that debate between the earlier than Clovis and the Clovis hypothesis. Your thoughts, James Waldo?
Yeah, in geology and in archaeology especially, interpretation is the name of the game, right? So when you look at anything in situ, and in this case, artifacts, you look at it and you think, okay, is this in situ? Is this how this started out? Is this a horizon where people lived, or do you got some stuff jumbled up here? And if it is, how did it get that way? Was it laid down, jumbled up? Was there a bunch of different artifacts that were kind of laid down at the same time by, stuff people carried in and laid down, or did it move? Right. So there are some different processes that allows the soil, which is what we're talking about here, to move around. And one obviously is water, right? Water can move stuff around. Wind, maybe a little bit here, probably not as much. But the other thing is, if the ground's not perfectly flat, there's a process called mass wasting. And it's basically where under gravity, the soil moves downhill over time, right? And it's kind of a seasonal thing, water works on it a little bit, but a lot of it has to do with moisture in the soil and how cold it gets, right? So you get a little bit of frost and the soil kind of swells up a little bit, and then it thaws and it moves just a little bit. And over time, and over these types of time period, or lengths of time, you can get a pretty good amount of movement. So like at White Pond, a lot of those excavations that we volunteered on, those items that are where they are now, they didn't start out there, and that's in sand. So sand really likes to move a lot. Those things started up the slope somewhere and worked their way back down. But also in the northern latitudes, which I don't have a ton of experience with, but I know enough about the processes, you get significant frost heaving, right? So that's where there's so much water in the ground that during the winter, it freezes solid down to several feet, and it actually causes huge swelling in the ground. So like if you go to like Yellowstone, sometimes the roads in Yellowstone during the wintertime get destroyed and have to be repaved during during warm weather, because you get these huge humps and all of that stuff can move that stuff around. So all that has to be taken into consideration when you're looking at something that's potentially in situ now. Is this where it started out, or was there something else that acted on it over, these millennia and got this to where it is now? So like I said, interpretation is where it's at, right?
Right. And James, I don't think you or I are necessarily trying to challenge the opinions of far more credentialed archaeologists, but I think your geological perspective is important. I think that the cultural perspective, in terms of having, looked at the landscape and the kind of, back and forth between the different groups who have proposed different models of entry into North America, when that happened, how it happened, who actually arrived here. I think it's important to ask all these questions, and as much as they are asking questions that may challenge the predominant kind of paradigms in archaeology, we ask questions as well. One of the two interpretations is going to be right, but like you said, James, it all comes down to interpretation, doesn't it? That human factor.
Yeah, certainly. And, and that's why we like those other things that we can also add to the interpretation that help us out, like carbon dating. We talked about the story a while back about the footprints at White Sands, right? And there's no way to date a footprint in sand, but it had a seed pod of some kind in it that was carbon dated to like 23,000 years ago. So, I mean, if the footprint was there first, the older seed pod, they probably didn't step on a 13,000-year-old seed pod, which is about how old it would have been, or 10,000-year-old at the time if humans only went back 13,000 years in North America. So it was the footprint's probably older than the seed pod, which is 23. The seed pod is 23,000 years. So how do you interpret that? I mean, unless you've got some other thing to kind of disprove that or make you think differently, you kind of got to interpret it like it is, right? Like you find it. So is that the right interpretation?
Yeah, I think it's important above all to just keep asking questions. It's good to examine again, go back and look at these sites, continue to use technology as we move forward, and just keep asking questions. Let's think about it. Let's look at every possible aspect before we make it gospel. But I think it's important to keep asking questions.
Indeed. Keep asking questions about the ancient past. That's really a kind of pastime of ours, and one that is shared by our friend who joined you guys out there on the road, our pal Chase Pipes, who, if I couldn't be there, I'm certainly glad Chase was in pocket. What's happening, by the way, over there at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room? Did you guys get to drop by on your way?
We actually did not. However, we were able to stop by and meet some folks associated with it and get to see a lot of really cool things along the way. And so, yes, Chase, always being the entrepreneur, was able to pick up some great new minerals while we were out on the road. Quick little stop off, met a really nice gentleman there, local to Tennessee, and we're able to pick up some really interesting euperlites. So if you guys are not familiar with euperlites, it's a very cool stone that happens to glow under UV light, and these are coming from around the Lake Superior area up in Michigan. So really cool stone and minerals, something I was not familiar with, but I learned about it, and it was a lot of fun to check it out. You always learn something when you're with Chase out on the road. We had great hours-long discussions about everything from, history and archaeology to minerals to a lot of stuff about out west. Again, lamenting the fact that I haven't got to get out there yet. Chase has been out there many, many times and seen what the world of archaeology, history, and minerals, fossils, all of those great things that the Relic Room is known for. He was able to fill me in on a lot of that great information. And so lots of new things coming into the store: dinosaur bones, shark's teeth, minerals, all the great things that you would come to expect from the Smoky Mountain Relic Room there inside of the Smoky Mountain Knife Works in Sevierville, Tennessee. And of course, you can always find them online at therelicroom.com. Remember, they are newly expanded with a beautiful new display for the rocks and minerals and all the great things that you love about the Relic Room, available now both at the store and at therelicroom.com.
Indeed, going to the Relic Room is, in more ways than one, like traveling back in time. In fact, it even looks like it. The decor is just incredible. And of course, we do a lot of work trying to maintain our appearance online, the 7 Ages Research Associates, that is. So be sure and check us out at our beautiful Instagram channel, and of course also on Twitter, on Facebook. We have our Facebook group, and all the episodes can be found over there at 7ages.org. And don't forget about the Patreon.
Of course, the Patreon, something new that we have. We have a brand new couple podcasts over there. One is the Cross Time Pub. That is an exclusive extra podcast for all of our Patreon subscribers. And if you want to get the jump on what we were recording out there on this road trip, we have 4 episodes already posted over there at the patreon.com. So that's patreon.com/7 Ages podcast, or you can just go to Patreon and type in 7 Ages podcast. It's going to come right up. We have 3 tiers there for you to enjoy, but even at our introduction tier, you can get the brand new 4 episodes that we recorded each night back at the hotel. We would go out, do these interviews all day, go back to the hotel, hook all the equipment up, and we would catch you up on our initial impressions, hot off the press, of what we thought about each site. And we've got those. We were posting them from James's house as we were moving across the country there. So each night we were getting those up for you. If you want to hear that in advance of the podcast series that we have coming up soon, you can go ahead and check us out at patreon.com/7 Ages podcast.
Excellent. And it's about time for us right now to check out a conversation that you guys had well before you went out on the road and while I've been down here in Brazil with Metin Eren. This is going to be a fantastic conversation with Mr. Eren. I've really been looking forward to hearing this, and we've got that coming up right here next on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the 7 Ages Audio Journal, we welcome Metin Eren. He is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Kent State University and a Research Associate at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in Cleveland, Ohio. He has degrees in anthropology from Harvard and Southern Methodist University. He also has a degree in experimental archaeology from the University of Exeter and a certificate in ceramics from Canterbury College. He has conducted research in Canada, China, Denmark, France, India, Ireland, Japan, Norway, Tanzania, Turkey, the Republic of Georgia, the United Kingdom, and across the USA. His research has been featured in international media, including PBS Nova, the History Channel, the BBC, the Discovery Channel, NPR, among many others. Dr. Eren, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Hey there.
Well, we appreciate you joining us here. You know, you've been on the list for a long time, so it's great to finally have you here at the Cross Time Pub, joining us here on the show. So tonight we're going to be focusing on your paper on the efficacy of Clovis fluted points. So we're very much looking forward to getting into this conversation. And to kick things off, to kind of get us in the mood, if you will, we have a quote here that's featured in the paper from the famed archaeologist George Friesen on the efficacy of Clovis fluted points for hunting proboscideans. Quote, "It may not be too strong a statement to say that the Clovis projectile point is the first piece of flaked stone weaponry in the world that was well enough designed to allow a single hunter a dependable and predictable means of pursuing and killing a large mammal such as a mammoth or a bison on a one-to-one basis." So that's a pretty bold statement. And of course, Friesen was a monumental archaeologist, but Dr. Eren, let's start right there. So oftentimes the conversation when it comes down to that famed fluted Clovis point, that lanceolate point, is just how effective was it and to what degree was it used? So to start the conversation, in your opinion, as an experimental archaeologist amongst many other fields of research, what's the conventional wisdom regarding the use of these Clovis fluted projectile points?
Yeah, so first I just want to say that I love that quote that you just gave by Friesen, because I love thinking about this idea that a person who uses Clovis technology wakes up one day and sort of stretches after a good night's sleep and thinks, you know what, I'm going to get me a mammoth today. And so, and they grab their one spear and they like, see ya, I'm going to go get mammoth. And they just walk up to one and take it down just by themselves. Because that's what that quote says, right? That you could take down a mammoth with your Clovis point on a one-to-one basis. And I think the conventional wisdom in a lot of ways is that the Clovis point is some sort of like Stone Age AK or right. Paleolithic bazooka.
Yeah.
That, you can you make a Clovis point and you're invincible. And that's hyperbole, right? I mean, it's just it's a little out there, but that's the conventional wisdom, that the Clovis point is the end all and be all, the pinnacle of stone weaponry.
Absolutely. Well, the conversation picks up there. Most people, I'm sure, listening have a good idea of what a Clovis point looks like. But in reality, let's break it down a little bit further for those who may not be more familiar. And when we talk about that technology, that lithic technology, if you will, as you said, it's often considered to be this super weapon, this mega weapon that just had this magical power and ability to drop megafauna all across the continent. So let's talk about what is a Clovis point in design and diagnostics, and what do you think it was actually used for in totality?
So the first thing right off the bat, I think to note is that there's tremendous variability in Clovis points, right? I mean, you get small ones and big ones and narrow ones and wide ones and really thin ones and thick ones. I mean, the variability is through the roof. And as sometimes I describe to my students, right, we have, the Danny DeVito level of Clovis point, and then we've got the Serena or Venus Williams level of Clovis point, where there's just a huge, just like there's tremendous diversity in humans and all sorts of cultural or biological phenomena. There's a huge variety of Clovis points. Now, we can speak about averages, right? So on average, a Clovis point can be anywhere from 10 to 12 centimeters in length. It's got really sharp, long edges along its blade. It usually has some sort of concavity at its base, and that concavity varies depending on region. And then the thing I think that unites sort of this species or this group of phenomena of Clovis points are those flutes, right? You get flutes that are removed from the base, and flutes are channels or grooves. And those flutes extend from the base up the point anywhere from 10% the length to sometimes more than half the length. There's a lot of variation in how long those grooves or flutes travel up the point. But again, everything I just said, that's kind of averages, right? I mean,
yeah, sure. So what we're looking at is a good description of the point itself. And then, I can't help but think about when we're talking about design, when you see something later down the road, still in the Paleo-Indian camp, but basically an evolution of that type of point, we see something like a Dalton, which tends to be much sharper. And from experimental points of view, I would tend to think that it would sink deeper into an animal and have more penetration. Is that what you find through your experimentation?
That a Dalton would be deeper or penetrate deeper?
It's based off the sharper point in the design, something like a Dalton or a Redstone here in the Southeast, something in that family that tends to have a more triangular shape versus the sort of rounded shape we see with a Clovis point. From the experimental things that you've done in the past, what do we see as far as something like a Dalton versus a Clovis as far as penetrability and effectiveness in killing an animal?
Yeah, so there are a lot of factors that go into how deeply a point will penetrate some sort of target. Shape plays a role, so the different shape between Clovis and Dalton or Folsom could play a role. We know that stuff like tip cross-sectional area or tip cross-sectional geometry, how much drag occurs upon penetration affects how deeply a point will go. But there's other aspects of weaponry, especially ancient weaponry that don't preserve, that also influence penetration, right? How much kinetic energy was able to be, imparted to that projectile by either the human or the weapon system. And so when we talk about penetration, sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly how well certain points would function relative to each other, because even though a Clovis point may have a larger tip cross-sectional area than, say, a Dalton point or a Folsom point, which would suggest that a Clovis point doesn't penetrate as deeply. The problem is if the rest of the weapon system that doesn't preserve in the archaeological record is missing, and it usually is missing, maybe Folsom folks didn't have as long of atlatls as Clovis people did, so they didn't have as much kinetic energy with their launched weapons. So our estimates of how well Paleo-Indian weaponry worked is sort of contingent on the fact that all we get preserved in the archaeological record are those stone points. So we have to always be a little careful with any conclusions we make.
Yeah. So I was, as you were talking about this, I started to think about projectile points, even modern day, right? One of the big components of it is the delivery system, right? How did you deliver that projectile onto a target? And I started to wonder what evolved first, right? Did the points evolve to make the delivery system better, or did the delivery system evolve to deliver, more energy on the target? And, there's all these other factors, I guess, that would come into play, when the thing is actually launched from the human towards the animal or whatever the target is were they using more flat trajectories, or they use more like a parabolic kind of an arch to, use gravity to kind of increase the kinetic energy? And I never thought about that before, but it's kind of, which came first, the delivery system or the point?
Well, and what's interesting about what you just say is that assumes that there is a delivery system, right? We've never found a Paleo-Indian atlatl. We've never found a Paleo-Indian dart. We've never found a thrusting spear. We have no idea really how these things were used. We assume that they used the atlatl, but we don't know. Technologies come and go. So even though we find atlatls in the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, technologies get lost for various reasons. They get reinvented. And so it really is an assumption that Clovis people and later Paleo-Indians used the atlatl. It's very possible all they had were handheld thrusting spears. It's also possible that maybe they just use these things as knives at this point. Now, I don't think that's the case, but until we actually find that atlatl preserved in a saturated site or a super dry site, we have to be really cautious about how we interpret how these things were used.
Yes,
or projectile. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I've actually have never heard anybody say that before. It's obvious we don't, the delivery systems don't get preserved because they're organic material and they deteriorate over time. I guess if you got lucky and found, somebody preserved like the Iceman, with his weapons, you might find somebody, preserved in ice like that. But yeah, we're assuming a whole lot of things about how these people employed this technology.
And I think one thing that often gets underestimated too, especially with people that use Clovis technology, now I think the evidence clearly shows that there was a pre-Clovis occupation of North America. I think that's unequivocal at this point. But I also think that there were some regions of North America where Clovis probably was first, right? So the Great Lakes in New England were covered by glaciers, and so Clovis folks were moving into those northern regions. And now, as you move across a vastly empty landscape, there are critters out there that would probably want to eat you. Short-faced bear and saber-toothed tigers and dire wolf, all sorts of animals. And I think what gets underestimated a lot is the idea of the Clovis point for self-defense. And when it comes to self-defense, you do not want to throw away your Clovis point via a projectile system. What you would want is a handheld spear for defense. And so, that's something that I don't think gets enough credit to Clovis folks, that they probably had to defend themselves. And it was imperative that they did, given that they likely had low population densities. So any lost individual was a huge blow.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And, when we've had our conversations over the years with various folks on the road, just those conversations that we have talked about that quite a bit. When you're looking at a projectile point and you're thinking, man, this is the only thing between you and your family and a saber-toothed cat or a dire wolf or a short-faced bear or, a mammoth for that point. So it's imperative that we look at these things holistically. And that's why I was so attracted to your work, because not only are you thinking about those sort of things, but you're also doing the experimental side that kind of gives us some more insight into that. And so kind of thinking about that line of questioning, let's discuss for a moment the presence of Clovis points that we have found among the remains of various Pleistocene species. So, whether it's between ribs or, they're laid out in the stratigraphy among the bones, what have we learned from that insight at various sites, mostly throughout the West, but what indicators have we given as the use to the weapon from those locations?
Yeah. Well, I think because there's so much equifinality, there's so many ways that a Clovis point can end up at a site of an animal, right? It can be because the animal's already dead, and so they're scavenging the meat. It could be that they hunted it. Just the mere association of a Clovis point with the skeleton doesn't say that Clovis point was the murder weapon of that animal. And that's really important, that we acknowledge the limitations of what we can say archaeologically. I think a lot of people just see the association of a Clovis point with a skeleton and just assume that Clovis point, is the smoking gun. But, we know from all sorts of analyses that Clovis points were used as knives as well, right? Microware analysis, which is looking at stone tools with high-powered microscopes, sometimes even scanning electron microscopes, has shown time and again that Clovis points have the microscopic wear and polishes and striations that are consistent with butchery. Also, too, there's been lots of experiments done looking at the effectiveness of Clovis points as knives. People have butchered elephants with Clovis tools and show they work really well. They've butchered all sorts of other animals. So just because we find a Clovis point in association with a skeleton doesn't automatically tell us that Clovis point was a weapon. It could have been a processing tool of an already dead animal.
This conversation puts me in mind of the paper that came out a few years ago by Todd Siravel that asked that question. I believe, don't quote me on this, but it was something along the lines of how many is 14, talking about the various kill sites throughout the continent of North America. And, the argument there, does 14 show that they were indeed hunting these animals on a regular basis, or does 14 show that it was a very occasional opportunistic type of thing that they would do? And, most of those sites, the remains of the animals tend to be in a marsh or a bog or something very similar to that, meaning that it could have been a case of an animal simply being entrapped or bogged down in an area that couldn't escape, and it just made itself an easy target. So what are your thoughts on that number of 14 to 16? Because I know there's some other, if we include like El Fin de Mundo and down in Mexico and some other places. But ultimately, thinking about that number, what are your impressions?
Well, it's funny because you call them kill sites, right? And so that automatically assumes and incorporates this idea that Clovis killed those animals. And sort of that number 14 may not be 14 kill sites. It may be 7 kill sites and the other 7 are scavenged.
Sure.
So we have to be really careful with just sort of assuming that a site is sort of the place where a Clovis person took down an animal, when, look, if you don't have, projectile points embedded in bone, right, which is a point Vance Holliday recently made in an article, that we've never found a Clovis point embedded, to our knowledge, in a mammoth bone. But we do find other types of points embedded in bone.
Sure.
So, why is that? Why have we never found the tip of a Clovis point embedded in a mammoth? Now, again, I think Clovis folks hunted mammoth from time to time. I definitely think they do. And I think it would be difficult for any archaeologist to deny that point. I think the question is whether or not Clovis people were specialized mammoth hunters. And given our research, which I'm sure we're going to get into here, the Clovis point is not a specialized mammoth hunting weapon, which questions this idea that Clovis folks were specialized mammoth hunters.
Yeah, and you talk about that in the paper that we're discussing here, where there seems to be a lack of impact fractures on those Clovis points at large animal kill sites. So, and again, as you described at the very beginning with the description of the Clovis point, you tend to have those long edges, and unless it's been resharpened down to basically just the remainder that would have been discarded. But you do have those long edges. The microwear analysis showing that it has a multi-function to it. So, that is a very, very good point. And another thing that seems to be missing from the conversation is, other than like bison antiquus or something, we don't often see the other things that Clovis would have been hunting discussed as much as those few kill sites throughout the country.
Well, and also too, yes, there are I want to just clarify what you said about the impact scars, right? There is not a lack or a dearth of impact scars at mammoth sites, right? There are statistically less impact scars of Clovis points at mammoth sites relative to that we find of bison sites. And so again, like, you know, people, I think Clovis people were definitely hunting mammoth from time to time. But they don't seem to be doing it as much as maybe bison. And they certainly don't seem to have weaponry that is specialized for that task. So I think there's been a little confusion about that paper where, you know, this idea of the Clovis point and how well it was used for hunting. It is definitely a hunting weapon. It is not the end all and be all of hunting weapons, but it is definitely still a hunting weapon.
You know, before we go further, I think one of the important things about this conversation, and we don't say this out loud so much, but you know, one of the points of this show is to just have you know, elevate science, right? Yeah. Science and the scientific method and you know, clear thinking about subjects. And one of the things that we covered here was assumptions about this subject, right? And it's very important, especially in critical thinking in general, but especially in the scientific method, is to know what your assumptions are, right? And revisit those assumptions on occasion and analyze those. You know, are these still valid assumptions? Can we still assume this, or, you know, do we have new information and maybe we need to throw this old assumption out and add some new assumptions based on that? And I think that's very, very, very important about that. And that actually, there were some things that we were assuming here in this. You know, this is not my main, it's obviously not my main area of study, but there were some things that are assumed about this culture and this technology that I actually had not even questioned before. You know, delivery methods and all the things we talked about. And I think this is a fabulous conversation in that vein.
2 points to that, right? I think that's, you know, what you just said is spot on. And, you know, I went on a Nova special a few years ago where, you know, I said that Clovis folks could take down any large animal basically at will with a Clovis point, right? And then we did a bunch of science, and I changed my mind based on the evidence and the data. And so that's really great. And why I think that's really neat what you just said is that is the whole point of experimental archaeology, is to look at assumptions we have about material culture and artifacts and technology and put it to the test. And I think for too long, a lot of archaeologists sort of, you know, would look at an artifact and they would sort of intuitively try to just guess at what this thing was or how it was used or how well it functioned. And based on the reputation and prestige of that archaeologist, their authority was the determining factor as to whether or not a hypothesis was accepted or rejected, right? And that's not the way science should work, right? It shouldn't be based on a person's reputation. It should be based on evidence. And, you know, you started off with that quote with Frison at the beginning. You know, a lot of archaeologists, I think, see that quote and about how you could take a Clovis point and hunt a mammoth one-on-one. And because Frison is such an amazing archaeologist, right? He had huge contributions. They accept his opinion without question. When really what they should say is prove it. And that's where experimental archaeology comes into the play.
Yeah. So and I'm sure you're familiar with this quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but, you know, Richard Feynman, the famous American physicist, has this quote that says, "It doesn't matter how smart you are, how beautiful your theory is. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong." Yeah.
No, that's a great quote. You know, what is it? A beautiful theory gets killed with ugly facts.
That's exactly right.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that's a perfect place to pick up the conversation because, Metin, another reason we wanted to have you here tonight is because of your experience with experimental archaeology. And I think that's, you know, vitally important, not only to the conversation, but to the future of the research. As far as archaeology goes, this is going to be one of the prime indicators that we learn the most from. So let's pick it up there as it is in the paper and talk about first of all, let's talk about your initial experience with experimental archaeology. What was it that was attractive to you about that discipline?
Well, I think initially, I started doing experimental archaeology as an undergraduate. I started doing archaeology when I was 16 years old. I was working with the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and I was actually directing grad students in the field as a high school student, which, I'm not sure they loved, but being sort of told what to do by some punk ass high school student. But then I went off to college, and my undergraduate advisor, Ofer Bar Yosef, who was just a brilliant man and incredibly kind. And he saw that there was a dearth of young archaeology flint knappers. And he sort of saw flint knapping within the archaeological community as dying. And he said to me that he really thought that if I could start to pursue and become good at flint knapping, that I could, sort of learn a lot about archaeology and make some really interesting contributions. And so I started to practice flint knapping, and Ofer would buy me material with his Stone Age lab funds and everything, and I got pretty good. And I actually published my first paper doing experimental archaeology as an undergraduate. And so that was really, I got off to a good start. But I sort of started to go down I don't want to say a bad path, but a very intuitive path, sort of this idea that because I was a flint knapper, I had some sort of special insight into stone tools and all this sort of stuff. Now, luckily, I went to Southern Methodist University for grad school. And there, my Ph.D. advisor, Dave Meltzer, helped me hone how I could use my flint knapping ability to do better science. And what we always have to be careful with when you do experimental archaeology, and especially if you've got the skills yourself like I do to make Clovis points or stuff like that, is to always make sure that our authority and intuition on how we make this stuff doesn't influence the objective and quantifiable tests that we do. Because it's very easy for me to whip out a Clovis point and people think, oh, wow, he must have some real deep insights because he can make the technology of these people. And that's not the case at all. Really, we have to be extremely careful with experimental archaeology, that we never go beyond what the data say and what sort of structured scientific studies can say. Now, I continued to do experimental archaeology. I actually then went over to England and studied with Bruce Bradley for 2 years and really improved my flint knapping even more. And then when I came back to the United States, I studied under the late Robert Patton, who, in my opinion, is the best flint napper in 3 million years of stone tool making. And now, I've gotten to a point with my flint knapping where basically I need to practice the technology if I want to study it. And then once I get good at it, I can just do it. I can just teach myself different technologies. And so recently I've gotten really interested in questions about Folsom. And so over the last summer, I practiced making Folsom points, and now I'm doing Folsom. And so it's, it's nice to have this ability to generate test specimens for all the experiments we do. Now, little did I know, back as an undergraduate and graduate student, that I would have the chance to come back to my home region of Northeast Ohio and found the Kent State Experimental Archaeology Lab, where we've got the whole wing of a building, where we've got a ballistics range and an $80,000 Instron materials tester and a forge and a pottery studio. And we can basically make any artifact from the last 3 million years and then reverse engineer it to figure out like how it works and what it could have been used for. So I'm pretty lucky, and experimental archaeology has been very good to me.
I'm not usually one to be an envious person, but I got to tell you, I got like a lightning bolt of jealousy going through me right now. That's a cool job, man.
It's pretty sweet. And I think what's nice too is that experimental archaeology it's at a very immature state, right? There's still a lot of science and engineering that we need to learn and incorporate to make sure that experimental archaeology eventually joins more mature sciences, physics, chemistry, engineering, stuff like that. But because of its immaturity, scientifically and theoretically, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. And this is why we've been very lucky and fortunate the last few years to publish lots and lots of papers on all sorts of different technologies, because when you combine experimental archaeology with physics and engineering and stuff, there is just so much to learn. And what I'm really getting excited about is the potential of applying what we're learning from the archaeological record and from experiments to potentially create technologies that have practical daily use in modern people's lives, right? In the same way that biologists will study jellyfish and undersea creatures to understand their energy and bioluminescence and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a possibility that there's things in the archaeological record technologically that could potentially improve people's lives today once we understand those technologies in a scientific way. So, it's just a very exciting time, I think, for experimental archaeology. And in my opinion, too, I think experimental archaeology is going to play a large part in the future of archaeological research, right? I mean, you mentioned Todd Surville. He published a really great paper a couple years ago talking about how the rate of archaeological discovery is decreasing because the archaeological record is a finite resource. And so we're just not finding sites as often. And there's other reasons why we may not want to excavate sites for ethical reasons or practical reasons or whatever, financial reasons. So if that's the case and field work is sort of decreasing, the way we study the past is in the lab via experiment. So it's just a really neat time.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you talked about the finite nature of archaeological research, field research, which is very true. And we talked about this on here before, but I think that the final frontier maybe of archaeology is maybe underwater archaeology along the periphery of the continental boundaries. Because a lot of history, is hidden under, 400 feet of sea level rise in the last 12 or 15,000 years. So, which is it's very expensive to do and it's very dangerous, right?
Well, that's it. I just reviewed a book by Dave Thulman and Tom Garrison where they're talking about archaeology in Florida, and a lot of it is underwater, and it just blows you away. Just some of the potential discoveries they can make. People like Andy Hemmings as well, and Ashley Lemke are doing a lot of underwater archaeology. So I mean, what we're going to find underwater is pretty exciting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. We have had the pleasure of having both Andy Hemmings and Jesse Halligan on the show in the past. And
Jesse too. She's awesome.
Yeah, of course, at Paige Latson. And the insight that they were able to give us on what's going down there in Florida makes it truly exciting for the future. And I think that will certainly be a hotbed for archaeology as we move forward. But returning to the discussion of the experimental side, because this is at the heart of this episode, and I really want to kind of dig into some of the details about that. Now, recently we talked to Dr. David Kilby, and some of his work was showing at least a 200-year overlap, or what appears to be a 200-year overlap between Clovis and Folsom. And so we see that technology sort of changing and converging. So when you mentioned the fact that you were looking into the Folsom point, let's pick the conversation up there, because again, I think that's very important to the overall 30,000-foot view, if you will, of looking at Paleo-Indian activities, adaptations, evolutions of these types of points and projectiles. So for the listening audience, please give us a description of the Folsom and how it differs from the typical Clovis point, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so earlier on when we were talking about Clovis points, we mentioned how there's just tremendous variability in Clovis points. That variability decreases with Folsom points. Folsom points are much more standardized as a population. There's a little bit of variation in length and width and stuff, but they seem to be almost like lithic ammunition, just where you can replace one with another over and over and over again. They're, as a population, thinner than Clovis points, much thinner. And the reason why they're thinner is because they've got full-faced flutes. So whereas Clovis points have flutes that extend anywhere from 10% or 50% along the length of a point, right? The grooves on Folsom points reach generally all the way to the tip. So the face on each side of a Folsom point is actually concave. And what that does is it really reduces the thickness of these points. Now, why exactly Folsom people would have these full face flutes is really a mystery to me, and I think a lot of archaeologists, because Folsom fluting is very difficult. It's arguably one of the most difficult things to do in flint napping. And I've napped technologies from around the world, and Folsom was definitely a challenge for me to learn. And even after you sort of learn it and know what you're doing, you're still going to break a lot of Folsom points in that fluting process, especially if you do it the way I do, which is just with direct percussion, which is just hitting the flute off. I don't use a lever or anything like that. Now, I think just hypothetically, those concave sides and really reducing the thickness of a Folsom point could have some functional benefits, right? So if your point is super, super thin, that does reduce that tip cross-sectional area. And this is a argument that Dave Hunziker has made, that, look, if you're going for super deep penetration, you want the smallest tip cross-sectional area as possible. And Folsom folks basically figured out a way to do that by having two concave sides. So that's possible, that they were doing it to increase penetration. You know, there's always the idea that because Folsom fluting is so hard, at least to modern nappers, that maybe it served as some sort of social signal. You know, basically, you know, I can do this amazing thing, and so you should follow me, you know, follow my leadership, whatever. Who knows? Now, that's where we have to be careful, right, with flint napping and stuff. Just because something is hard for modern flint nappers, there could have been some simple trick to flute Folsom channels that they had that was just, it made it easy for them. Now, I don't think that's the case, because we find lots and lots and lots of broken Folsom points, but we always have to just be careful. You know, just because modern flint nappers find something difficult, that doesn't automatically or necessarily mean prehistoric or ancient Folsom folks also found it difficult. I think they did, but still, we got to be careful. One idea I've had for a really long time, and I haven't tested it, so you guys are getting special treatment because I don't tell my untested ideas. But when you have concave faces on both sides of a Folsom point, it almost has the appearance of an I-beam. And one thing I've always wondered is whether or not that allows just a little bit of wiggle on the point that would somehow prevent breakage in some way. I don't know. It's just something I've been thinking about. Basically reduce it, or if you've got some torque on your point, it won't break. Again, that's an idea I've not tested. So that's pure speculation. You know, we don't need people on the internet saying, "Oh, Dr. Eren thinks Folsom people were making stone I-beams." And so, So yeah, who knows? It's a mystery. Right?
But those are the questions that lead to further experimentation, further, observation and research. Those are the type of questions we should be asking. And, I've always heard it said, and I want to get your opinion on this. I've always heard it said with the full face flutes, whether it be Folsom or something like a Cumberland point from the Tennessee region, that those were done with tool assisting, meaning some sort of leverage or some sort of extra tool rather than just direct percussion. Is there anything in the archaeological record that actually indicates that's the case?
So let me just say that full face flutes, whether it be on Folsom, Cumberland, Barnes, full face flutes can be done with direct percussion, right? You don't need a lever or indirect punches or anything like that. And again, I can flute Folsom points with just direct percussion. Now, sometimes with some Folsom points, some Cumberland points, that basal concavity, right, on the proximal section of that point is so deep that it would be almost impossible to get a percussion tool in that concavity. So in those situations, I think some other technique was used, maybe a punch. I'm very hesitant to say a lever. I don't think they used levers. It's possible. And with the lever, you would apply pressure to that platform, and that would pop off a flute.
Sure.
But I can't say for sure whether or not they use levers or not, because the lever likely would have been made out of antler or wood, and that stuff generally doesn't preserve. So
yeah,
that's
absolutely
a possibility.
Well, let's get into a little bit of, when we're talking experimental, let's get into a little bit of the materials being used themselves. So I know Folsom Points, being a Western style versus what we see here on the East Coast. I'm in South Carolina, so I'm very familiar with rhyolite coming out of North Carolina, Coastal Plains chert coming off the Savannah River. And obviously, Coastal Plains chert is a much preferred material over that grainy rhyolite coming out of North Carolina. But yet there's still been plenty of fluted and paleo implements found that have been created from rhyolite. So when we look at various materials, we've always heard that, the Clovis sought out those high-grade materials because of the types of point that they're creating. But with something like Folsom, do we see that same tradition? Are they seeking out a certain type of material in order to create it, or is it across the board as well?
Oh, that's a good question. So, because my familiarity with Folsom is not as strong as it is with Clovis. I've been fortunate to publish a couple papers on Folsom and work on actually a couple Folsom sites, but it's certainly not my specialty. Now, I do know at the Mountaineer site, which is a Folsom site in Gunnison, Colorado, where they seem to actually be making houses, right? Architecture in the Gunnison Basin, which is really cool, on the top of W Mountain. And that was an excavation led by Brian Andrews, Dave Meltzer, and Mark Steiger. They have a Folsom point that was found there made on a welded tuff, which is a very chalky material. And I look at that even as a flint knapper, and I'm just like, how the heck did they do that? And I think this speaks to a larger issue with raw materials and archaeologists' impressions of different raw materials. Archaeologists love to look at stone raw materials and say, oh, that's a high quality material, or that's a low quality material, or whatever. Where a flint knapper who knows what they're doing can really make anything out of anything. So the idea of quality really becomes a subjective sort of term. That's one of my pet peeves, I think, is when archaeologists talk about, oh, this raw material is really high quality. Well, in what way? You can have a raw material that's high quality because it's very brittle and easy to knap. It can be high quality in that it gets very sharp. It can be high quality in the fact that maybe it's more durable than other raw materials. There's all sorts of different ways you can define quality. But getting back to your question, both Clovis and Folsom, I think, even though if they tended toward more cryptocrystalline, siliceous materials, high siliceous cherts, they still could make whatever they needed on quartzites or basalt or anything like that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking about while we're talking about this, is even in material that comes from the same, in the same spot, basically, from I'm in Little Rock, just across the river down here. We've got novaculite, huge deposits of novaculite. And even in the novaculite, there's great variation, right?
Oh,
even just, you can have one boulder and there's, only part of it is suitable to your purpose, whatever it is, whatever that quality is that you're looking for in the material, that kind of defines, just like you said, high quality. So what you're looking for may not be what the other, group is looking for. And, your high quality is their low quality and just garbage. So,
well, and I think one thing too, I mean, through this talk, you keep hearing me talk about variation and tendencies, right? And this is where I think, and this is the way archaeology is going, as well as psychology and economics and anthropology and basically the study of culture in general, right? Is we need to start thinking in terms of not stereotypes and averages, but in terms of populations. And so, yeah, you may have an average Clovis type, but there's a lot of variation around that average. And we need to start thinking in terms of bell curves. And more and more that's happening. So that's a very promising thing.
That's a very interesting point. And as a matter of fact, I just want to say this. We've had a lot of very good talking points come up in here, so many that we could carry this episode on for quite a while, but trying to stay focused here, let's continue the conversation with some of the actual experimentation that's been done. So I know that over the years, both Frizen and some other people, as well as yourself possibly, have actually tried out these implements on proboscideans, elephants in Africa, different types of animals. So what are we learning from the actual experimentation in the field that's happening today?
Yeah. Well, I've never had the opportunity to throw Clovis points at a dead elephant. Now, George Frizzen did in the 80s. Unfortunately, he never reported how deeply those Clovis points penetrated. He wrote a paper in 1989 in the journal American Antiquity that basically said these things work, and that was it. But he never actually said where the points penetrated, how deeply they penetrated, all sorts of stuff that no one could get away with today. And so it's just one of those things where if I was asked to review a paper where someone threw a bunch of points at a dead elephant and they said these work, but they don't provide the penetration depths, I would say, prove it, right? And I think that's what archaeologists need to start saying regularly is prove it. Like your opinion or your intuition, your authority isn't enough. We need the data, we need the evidence. So unfortunately, we have not learned a lot from past experiments that have thrown experimental replicated points at carcasses. There was another one done where I think it was Dennis Stanford and Eric Callahan. They threw Clovis points. I believe it was the elephant Ginsburg. And unfortunately, that elephant had been frozen all the way through. And if you just look up any sort of basic meat science, when you freeze meat, it breaks down the cell structure and fibers and all that sort of stuff. So the first time Eric Callahan tried to throw atlatl darts into this elephant, the elephants wouldn't penetrate because it was frozen solid. So they waited until the elephant thawed out. Then they threw Clovis points in the elephant and they penetrated 50 centimeters. The problem with that is that they were essentially throwing their Clovis point darts into kind of like an elephant mush rather than, an actual carcass of something that would be more realistic.
Sure. Well, to this point, our conversation has been exceptional and one of the favorite ones that I've had in quite a while. And I want to pick up the conversation with getting more into that lab you have there at Kent. So let's get into some of the details. Now, that was one of the best descriptions of a lab I've heard. We're also going to, just so everybody knows, I think a future T-shirt idea might be lithic ammunition. So, Metin, that's the first time I've heard that term, and I love it. So, but let's get into what you guys do there at your lab. Now, it sounded very detailed, but give us an overview.
Yeah, so what's really neat is that we can focus on sort of two main areas, right? Artifact production and then artifact functionality or use. And the artifact production part can be tough, right? And oftentimes the students that we accept as graduate students, look, good grades are important, standardized tests, I don't really put a lot of weight into something like that. But what we really look for in students is people with unique skills, a woodworker or a flint knapper or a musician or a ceramic artist, right? People that have skills that take years and years to learn, because those skills, I think, are underappreciated in today's society, but they can contribute so much to experimental archaeology. We've admitted tattoo artists, right? I mean, people with just really awesome skills that could provide insights into the past. And so, once students get admitted to the program, we can teach them the science, right? What is a hypothesis? How do you structure predictions for a test? All that sort of stuff. What statistics to use? What we can't teach them, is that 10 years or 15 years of experience working wood or making pots or whatever. So, people with those sorts of very hands-on skills make huge contributions to our lab, and we can do all sorts of tests there, looking at the efficiency of producing Clovis points, or how quickly can a certain pot be made using a particular type of temper, right? So that's the artifact production stuff, and that's really important archaeologically because the time put into making stuff or how they make stuff reveals a lot about prehistoric economy, sometimes mobility, stuff like that. The other aspect of our lab is artifact functionality. And this is where we sort of do the reverse engineering, right? Why are they making certain designs? And this is where we will shoot different types of arrowhead or spear point. Does one type of projectile point penetrate deeper than another type? Is one type more durable than another type? Do they have different aerodynamic trajectories? But we not only do that with stone, we do it with all different types of materials. Like, does one type of pot hold heat better than another type of pot, right? So all sorts of questions about functionality of artifacts. And what's really neat about that is once we understand how this stuff is made, and once we understand how it's used or how it functioned relative to other varieties, right? Then we can start to build models of how technology evolved over time, because we can go to the archaeological record and say, oh, look, this older artifact doesn't penetrate as well as this younger artifact that comes after it. It looks like some sort of selection occurred where people wanted to penetrate prey better, and so they designed their artifacts evolutionarily to penetrate better. Where it also gets interesting is where you get the opposite, right? Where you've got an artifact that is older and it performs better than what comes later. Because evolution is not like a singular unilinear process where things constantly get better and better and better. Oftentimes in the archaeological record, we see technologies not work as well later in time as they did earlier in time. And that's where we can say, oh, well, was there some sort of population crash where the knowledge of how to make this sort of superior functional artifact was lost? And so that's why people had to resort to making this artifact that doesn't work as well. So really, experimental archaeology, and I think why it's having such a resurgence now, is it's really been melding with evolutionary theory. And it's just allowed us to make all sorts of really neat conclusions about the past that really weren't possible until the last few years.
Absolutely, and incredibly well put. I think that really sums up the whole idea behind experimental archaeology and the role that it's going to play as we move forward in the future. It's something that I am, for one, very excited about. And if we happen to get back up that way, which I would like to get back to Ohio in the fall or possibly by next spring, would it be possible for us to see the lab? Is that something we could do?
We give tours all the time, and we do a tremendous amount of outreach. I give anywhere from 12 to 15 public talks a year to various archaeology chapters. Those chapters come to our lab. I've done tours for school kids. It's really important that I think when, the Kennedy quote, right? To whom much is given, much is expected. And we've been given a lot here. It's our responsibility to give back and to share what we learn as widely as possible. So by all means, come and we can spend the day flint napping and doing experimental stuff. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a flint napper as well, but I certainly need to increase my skill set. And, having a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old kind of limits the amount of time I get to focus on that. But I'm certainly looking forward to getting up there and learning some more of the ins and outs. So tonight we've been speaking with Dr. Metin Eren, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Kent State University and someone who is leading the charge for experimental archaeology into the future. Dr. Eren, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you tonight. You have given me several new lines of questioning to follow, and this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been awesome.
What an incredible interview with Metin Eren, Kent State University professor. This is one of my favorite interviews that we've done in a while. It was just fun to really get into the ideas behind the Clovis point. Oftentimes we're talking about that techno-complex and those people and whether they were here at what time and all of that, but to really kind of hone in on the actual Clovis point, talk about how it was used, and then get into that great conversation on experimental archaeology and all of the wonderful things they have there at Kent State University. We've got to get up there and see that lab. We got the open invitation. You heard it from Metin. We got to get up there and check it out, guys. I am excited about that.
Absolutely. I would love to get up there and check that out. One of the many wonderful opportunities that comes with this line of work, and that's why we enjoy it so much, learning about the ancient past. And of course, it's fun when you enjoy the people you work with. That's why you guys are my preferred time-traveling companions. And so it's about time for us to pony up for one more here in the Cross Time Pub before we head back to the everyday. We love spending time here in the ancient past. Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and I, we are the Seven Ages Research Associates. Find us online at sevenages.org. And of course, as always, we'll see you next time right here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.